Welcome to Newtown Hangouts, and this week we're going to be interviewing Dr. Ant Greenham on his new book, The Questioning God. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So, if we start out with a kind of a very basic question is, if we believe in absolute truth, and I've read your book, I know you do, and God is the source of all truth, then how can we really go about questioning God? If he knows everything, what room is there to question?
Oh, well, the problem is we don't know everything. And the way we get to find out about it is by questioning. And really, truth is at the very heart of this thing. There is an absolute truth, but the way that we get to apprehend it is by having our minds engaged. And one of the best ways to engage the mind is by questioning. But God encourages us to question so that we can find out the truth which is absolute and clearly defined.
So, are you saying that we should question what God says, or how do we go about questioning God?
This is a great question. We need to be convinced that this is really what God has to say. In other words, if it doesn't make sense, is there something that I'm missing here? Have I interacted with all the aspects of the way that this statement's coming across? Are there things that I'm missing? And when you go through that process, and when you come to the conclusion that this is actually what God has said, because you've gone through that process, you're so much more settled in your confidence that what God has said is true than you would have been if you'd simply accepted it blindly without any questioning at all. So it's very much a case of questioning so that we can come to a very clear truth. The mind must be engaged to do that.
That's something I certainly agree with. I know in my own life there's been many times where I sort of believe something, but I'd never really questioned it. And then somebody will come up, someone who disagrees with me and challenge me, and I'll end up going in and digging in and trying to do some research and finding out what really is. And most of the time I actually come away with finding out the evidence was a lot stronger than I thought it was. On a few occasions I find out that what I believed wasn't correct, and I ended up changing my views on that.
That's exactly the point. You know, just speaking for myself, two points here. Often when questions are raised by people of a perhaps more liberal persuasion about the veracity of Scripture, I found in my experience that when I dig and ask questions, what's really going on here? What's the background? What's the text really saying? I emerge with a much greater confidence in the Scripture than I would have if I just said, I'm going to believe it because I'm told to. And the other thing, of course, is the fact at the very center of our Christian faith, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I would encourage people to question that. Do you really believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Look into it, and you'll be amazed how strong the evidence is that he really was raised from the dead.
I agree. What impact would that have, do you see, on a Christian's life? Say I'm an average Christian, and you say, do I believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ? I say yes. So why do I really need to, if I believe it, why do I need to go look at it in detail? Why do I need to look at the evidence?
Oh, two reasons. Firstly, a lot of people don't believe it. And so if you are interacting with people around you, people around me, people around us, and that'll be the vast majority of people, if we're wanting to share our faith in any meaningful way, we're going to have to be realistic in the way we engage them. And so we'll have to have thought through the issues that we're wanting to share as truth in the first place. But then as we are considering whether, as I said, the resurrection is really true, it isn't just a doctrine. It's a life-changing doctrine. Jesus died on the cross for our sins, rose again from the dead. Now, there's a whole lot of implications to that. Specifically, he died for my sins. That means my sin is so bad he had to die for it. And then God was so satisfied with Jesus' action on the cross that he raised him from the dead. This is a hugely influential statement which is going to have a direct impact on everything I do in my life. Basically, I then have absolute confidence in saying the way I was going on my own is wrong, the Christ way is correct, this is worth committing my whole life to, and even being prepared to die for it if necessary. But I must be convinced it's true before I take that position.
Yeah. So you see there are degrees of belief. There's degrees of you can't just say, well, I believe in the resurrection, but some people believe it, other people believe it more.
Yes, absolutely. But we need to change the word here. Let's put the word trust in the place of belief. And I think you can say, like a child would trust his or her mother. As you grow up, you realize, oh, my parents are false. They're not perfect people. And yet, in a way, your relationship changes and develops. And if it's a good relationship, you have stable, loving parents. That relationship is much stronger when you become an adult than it was as a child. But you might say there's an element of trust that was there all along. And so, yes, there are definitely levels of trust. But I'm saying it like that because I don't want to give the idea that you have to get a kind of a PhD in belief, a kind of a PhD in trust, before you can savingly trust in Christ for the first place, in the first place. As Jesus said, trust like that of a little child is always necessary.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm actually one of my beliefs is in faith, that we oftentimes confuse faith with simple belief, or even blind faith, where we don't have any evidence. In fact, I actually had a Mormon I was talking to once, and I was pointing out the lack of evidence for the Book of Mormon.
Yes.
And he thought that was really great, because the less evidence there was, it meant the more faith he had. And I always thought that was a little bit of a confused view of faith.
Yeah, it's tragic.
Yeah. I tend to define faith as the trust that we have in our beliefs that leads us to act on them.
Yeah, I'll agree with that.
I get that out of Hebrews 11.
Yes.
A great faith chapter. And if you look, all the examples there follow a general pattern. The pattern is so-and-so believed, therefore they did.
Mm-hmm.
And the faith is the confidence we have in our beliefs that lead us to act on them, that lead us to live our lives based on those beliefs.
Yeah. And the way we come to that confidence is by being mentally engaged and questioning. A quick example of blind faith, maybe you can identify this in a part of the world where you get more snow than we do here in North Carolina. My experience of skiing is very unsuccessful. I fall down, but I even fall down in the summer. What happened is there was a ski lift in upstate New York, and it was in June, was in the summer, everything was green. I thought that this thing was something you could sit on, instead of something you grab onto and it pulls you up the hill. So I promptly put all my weight on the thing, and the next thing I knew I'm rolling on the ground on the ski slope in the summer. But the point I want to make is I falsely put my faith in that object. And it was a stupid thing to do. I hadn't inquired, I hadn't engaged myself. I just thought, this looks good, let me rest my weight on it. Whoops. You don't want to have Christian faith like that.
No, and I think that actually when you see people who have some sort of tragedy in their life and they end up falling away from God, my belief is what really is going on there is that they had a false conception of God, that the God they believed in didn't turn out to be true because they were going along with essentially what was an illusion, like you getting onto the chairlift, and when that didn't support them the way they thought it was going to, it causes a crisis in their faith, which I think is a tragic outcome.
And all too often, this is the kind of shallow faith that is propagated in the popular culture, and people think that that's Christianity, and it's not at all. And so folks who go with that certainly aren't going to last long once the tragic reality of everyday life starts to hit.
Okay. We're talking with Ant Greenham, and we're talking about his book, The Questioning God. And in terms of the questioning God, what about some of the more negative aspects of it? What if we don't question? What does that really teach ourselves? I know you mentioned some of the problems with power and authority and control. So the lack of questioning, how does that negatively impact our lives?
Well, the temptation is you just cling on to the power that you have, and then you impose that on other people. And uh, they would be following you because they have no choice or feel they have no choice. But the the problem with that is there's a kind of a master-servant relationship, and what to be hidden behind the scenes is, firstly, as a servant, you might want to escape it at the first opportunity, or what I think is more common is once you find that you're in a position of authority, you simply repeat the same pattern that you experienced, and so the thing becomes a self-perpetuating process. And so really what you have then is a situation of people imposing their power and control over each other without them really coming to terms with what is the truth that that lies behind this. Where in some cases power can be affirmed, in other cases power should be nuanced, maybe set aside, maybe sent in a different area.
Okay. I notice in your book you're not dealing simply with Christianity, but you also deal with Islam and Judaism, and
Indeed.
I like the way that you put this out into sort of a spectrum. I happen to think that a lot of things in the Christian walk are a spectrum, and most of
Yes.
the history of the church is us going too far one way or the other. So,
Yes.
in
Yes.
terms of questioning God, you argue that on the one hand that you can question too much, on the other hand you can question too little. How does that work itself out in your book?
Well, this comes back to the first question that you answered this evening, which is how can we question God, and what about absolute truth? And I'm not challenging that for a second. There are very specific things about God which don't change. We come to know God. If I said to you, and this is perhaps a silly example, that I know I know President Obama personally. He's just like a typical person from Scandinavia, and but he speaks with a German accent, and actually he's quite conservative when it comes to issues of human sexuality. You just stop and you say, wait a minute, are we talking about the same guy here? And the point I want to make is, if you know somebody, that knowledge is going to be within certain parameters. So if I know you, you are you. I won't know someone else who's quite different to you. And of course, this is the same thing with God. God is certain things. He's revealed himself. And so we come to know the God who is there. And so we do it by means of a questioning approach. He encourages that. But eventually, once you've gone through the process of questioning, and it's very clear to you, having gone through that process of questioning and mental engagement, what the truth is, the question then is, are you going to surrender to the God who is there? Basically, are you going to say, I put all my trust in your hands. I'm no longer going to cling on to trying to do my life my own way. But a genuine step like that is not going to work unless you've gone through the questioning process. You really believe that God is trustworthy, and he is who he says he is. The revelation which we read in Scripture is correct, and it's worth it. In fact, it's the most important thing you could do, to cast yourself entirely in his hands.
Okay, so can you give us some examples of? We're sort of assuming here that God wants us to question. Where do you get that in the Bible? How do you see that coming from? That we are supposed to question rather than just believe.
Yes, it starts at the very beginning, and I think the first question isn't put in a form of a question, but it's implied, where you have Adam before the creation of Eve, and God presents the animals to Adam to see what he would name them. And then the text says, but a suitable partner for Adam wasn't found. And then, of course, the account moves to the creation of Eve out of Adam's side or rib. But that issue of Adam looking at the animals, giving them names, is really directly linked to questioning. In the Hebrew world, a name wasn't just a tag which you attached to something, In some ways, it would speak of its essence. So Adam had to look at the animal and figure out, how does this creature operate? And then give a name to it, which would be an accurate reflection of what that animal was. And so the name came out of an implied questioning process. I'm going to give you a few more examples, but a quick point here, you were just alluding to the fact that I say quite a bit about Islam and Judaism in my book as well. It's very interesting when we're comparing the biblical account of Adam and the animals to the Quranic account. In the Quran, God names the animals, and essentially the angels are asked what the names are, and they don't know. It's interesting that somehow the process whereby Adam is questioning and giving names to the animals is completely removed from the Quranic account. He's just told, here they are, that's where their names are. And so I believe that is the first naming incident or questioning incident in the scripture. But then once you start moving beyond the fall, the very first thing that God asks Adam is, where are you? Now, God knows exactly where Adam is, but it's for Adam to acknowledge, well, actually, I've run away, and I've run away because I've been disobedient. It was actually an opportunity for Adam to come to repentance on his own. Sadly, he doesn't. But that is a key question, and of course he says to Eve, what is this that you have done? And then as we go through the biblical story, we see questions occurring again and again. To Abraham, count the stars, see if you can number them. To Moses, what's this in your hand? Who gave man his mouth? For example, Isaiah, as you would say, he is asked, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? God knows what the answer is going to be, but he wants to engage these people all the way through. I'll give more examples, but I don't want to hold the conversation for too long.
Well, yeah, and as you were talking, one of the classic example that came to my mind was Abraham questioning God. You know, how many people need to be in the city? How many good people need to be in the city so that you wouldn't destroy it? And he really enters in sort of a negotiation there, and
yes, and isn't that fascinating that he gets it down to a minority of 10 people, and that would be enough to spare the city. And what's interesting too is here is someone questioning God, and yet he is described as the friend of God in the book of Isaiah. And so you seem to get the picture here that the questioning is not a bad thing at all. It's something that's welcome. I want to add a quick thing here about the questioning of Abraham there. He was fairly limited in what he thought God could do, as best I understand it. So his thinking was, if I can persuade God that there are 10 righteous people in the city, then the city will be spared. Of course, he was completely wrong. There were nowhere close to 10 people. So, if you like, God would have been perfectly within his rights in terms of that discussion with Abraham to blot out Sodom without any further ado. Instead, he sends in an angelic rescue service and pulls out Lot and his 2 daughters. So, it's like God is responding to the heart or the spirit behind Abraham's questions, but he isn't in a straitjacket limited by the specific terms in which Abraham framed it.
Interesting. Now, we've been talking about the Old Testament. In the New Testament, are we supposed to question, or is that something that changed? New Testament, we just have to accept?
No, even more so, you have questions in the New Testament. Jesus loved to question. For example, he's being challenged about paying taxes. So he asks for a coin to be brought, and then he asks whose image is on this coin. And firstly, by asking for the coin, they set themselves up, because it's clear that they have a coin which was minted by the Romans and used to pay a tax. In other words, they had no problem in having one on their person. Someone had one on this person, and it seems that all the qualms that they are suggesting about not paying taxes didn't go that far. But then, specifically, whose image is this? And of course, it's the image of Caesar. And so, having that question answered leads him to his powerful statement, to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. and to God the things that are God's. And there's an implied question there as well, which isn't stated specifically in the text. If the image on the coin means that the coin goes to the image bearer, whose image is on us? And of course, we made in God's image. In other words, when we talk about rendering to God, it means absolutely everything. All of you, all of me, everything that's linked up, wrapped up in our lives, that has to be rendered to God. So that is an implied question which, if you think it through carefully, actually strengthens devotion to God. Another example was Jesus asked his accusers about John the Baptist. Who did he go out to see? And that leads them to a spot of difficulty, because they admit that John was a prophet, and he'd say, why didn't you believe him? And if they say he wasn't a prophet, then they'd get into trouble with the crowds. And so here they are left with a rather foolish position of saying, we don't know. Of course they knew. But in a way, they are being publicly shamed by this question to show them, first and foremost, that they are at variance with God and his purposes and before God's prophet. And of course, the most important question is, who do men say that I am? And then, of course, specifically, as Jesus asked Peter, who do you say that I am? That's a question we all have to answer.
Yes, it is. We are this is Nerdy on Hangouts, and we're talking with Ant Greenham about his book, The Questioning God. Let's move back. We briefly brought up the fact of Islam. So is the tradition of questioning a strong tradition in Islam?
No, it isn't. And this is actually a reason why I got the idea, which led to me writing the little book in the first place. Just to set out the background, there are two major sources of documentation in Islam. There's the Quran, of course, which is the holy book, but there's also the Hadith, which are the traditions of the Prophet. And there's a massive amount of Hadith. Essentially, they come from different writers. Perhaps two of the most important writers are people called Bukhari and Muslim. But Bukhari's Hadith encompass 9 volumes. But if you go to one of the earliest and oft repeated hadiths, you have this encounter between Muhammad and the angel Gabriel in a place called the Cave of Hira, which is supposedly near Mecca. Now, without getting into the detail of whether this actually happened quite the way that the account puts it, leaving that aside, I think the account that's described in this hadith is really important for us to understand how Islam works. What happens is the angel Gabriel comes to Muhammad and says to him, recite. Now, the word he actually uses, and it's worth mentioning the Arabic word, is the word ikra. Now, if you hear the word ikra, you can hear it relate to the word Quran. They're really based on the same root. And so the Quran is actually recitation, but he's told to recite, and his response is, what must I recite? Well, I don't know how to recite. Some translators translate that as the word read, but the big thing is here is something that Muhammad must simply repeat, and repeating that is all that's required of him. Understanding it, coming to terms with it, working it into his worldview, doesn't feature at all. And this is where you have a key element in understanding how Islam really works. And here we come to another important word, which of course is Islam. Now, Islam can be translated 2 ways. What Muslims often like to say is that Islam means peace. So, for example, a favorite Muslim greeting would be Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. But you have to realize that the kind of peace that they're talking about, it's the peace of submission. And this is what Islam really means, that you are at peace because you have submitted to God. And this really is at the very heart of Islam. It's submission. Not understanding, not questioning, not mental wrestling, not trying to come to terms with something so you really understood it. But this is the body of truth you must submit to it. don't question it. Do what you're told and go from there. And I would respectfully suggest that that idea has colored the whole of Islam up to the present day. There have been historical examples of Muslims seeking to go in other directions, and certainly you have had Muslims who have questioned, who have done this mental wrestling. I'm not suggesting for a moment that that all Muslims are non-questioning people, not at all. But the context in which they operate is a context of submission, where their holy book, the Quran, is essentially a book of recitation, not so much understanding. And that idea was a tremendous revelation to me, and that's what led me to the question, well, Islam is like this. To what extent is Judaism the same or different? And of course, coming closer to home, to what extent is Christianity the same or different?
So you're saying one of the big problems in Islam is that they don't question, they just accept.
Yes, yes. And this is the culture. It's not that Muslims can't be questioning people. You can have a wonderful, engaging conversation with a Muslim, and where both you and the Muslim are both reflecting your common humanity, which I would argue is really a product of us being made in God's image. Of course, being made in the image of the questioning God. But when you get to the subject of, is Islam really true? This is something that they tend to skirt, and simply take on face value. This is what we've been taught. This is what we believe. Don't question it. Don't challenge it. Often, when challenges do come, sad to say, the Muslim response is more a matter of anger than a question of, well, what if you have a point? Maybe I should dig a bit and find out more. And I would argue that when Christians have a similar question thrown at them, our response should be just that. We should ask, well, maybe you've got a point. Let me dig a bit and find out more, rather than just get angry and say, how dare you question my faith? It's not going to help you or the person asking the questions.
Would you then say that, for example, this whole tradition of questioning within Christianity is what has led to things like the Reformation?
Oh, definitely. Here's Luther pondering what the book of Romans means, and he misunderstands the righteousness of God, and he's kind of angry about it, because in his mind it's something which is unfair. God requires this impossible standard of righteousness, until as he's wrestling with this, the penny drops and he realizes, oh my, it's a gift that God gives me, and that just revolutionizes the whole thing. But because of that mental engagement, wrestling he went through, the Reformation is born, and essentially he rediscovers the gospel, which is clearly there in the New Testament from the beginning.
So going back to Islam briefly, does that unquestioning also extend to a lack of questioning of other Muslims?
To a large extent. I think this is, and I need to be careful here, because one doesn't want to just condemn without thinking. I want to be consistent with what I'm saying about questioning, and not condemn people without thought. But it's very easy to paint another group, another section of your religion. I'm thinking especially of the Sunni Shia divide as the other. And once you've done that, it's very easy to start to develop animosity, and then of course give effect to that animosity by attacking people who would come from another tradition. It doesn't seem like Sunnis say, well, the Shiites say this. What if they have a point? What did Muhammad actually say in terms of the succession, which is really the issue between Sunnis and Shiites. The Sunnis say that the community should decide who the successor to the Prophet should be. The Shiites say, no, it should be in the family. And turning the thing around, the Shiites could say, well, what if that report of the first council that took place right after Muhammad's death is correct, and that the people did what was best, and that the familial thing was actually a bit of an attempt to usurp power. And they don't tend to do that. They tend to write off the other side as wrong by default, and we're right by default. And it's very easy for animosity to grow to dangerous levels from there.
Yeah, I know for me, it's one of the things that's troubled me is that it seems like if there's a report of a Koran, turns out to be false, but being put down a toilet, there's riots in the Muslim world, yet people commit horrendous acts in the name of Muhammad and of Allah, and it basically goes with that. I haven't seen any of the big protests out there.
Yeah.
That's
I think this is part of the problem, is that that whole mindset is not well equipped to be critical, to be analytical. And so because they don't instinctively have that feature available to them, they will typically go with a knee-jerk response of reacting quite vehemently to any hint of criticism. And I think this is something that Westerners often fail to appreciate, because our society is so strongly laced with analysis, self-criticism, digging to see what's true, what isn't, trying to find the other side of the story, that just to think that there could be a whole society where this is not common. Not that people in that society are unable to do it, but just it's not a common societal thing in Islamic environment to be analytical, to be questioning. And so they find it very difficult when they hear a challenge not to go with the easy response, which is simply to get upset and feel challenged. Let me add something to that, if I may. There's a very influential group here in the United States called CARE, Council of American Islamic Relations. I get their stuff on a daily basis, and I read as much of it as I have time to. They keep a beady eye open for any hint of any Islamophobia, and I understand that. That's their constituency, and those are the people that they're serving. But typically what will happen is if there is a criticism of Islam somewhere, what they will do is encourage people to, quote, write respectful letters to your congressman, unquote. They never say, how about considering whether this is true or not? That's not part of the deal. I've never seen anything like that, that Muslims are encouraged to question whether this criticism has some merit or not. Rather, no, we must stop this thing. We need to put pressure on our congressman to prevent this kind of criticism happening again.
Yeah. And there are Muslims out there who are doing that. It's just they, for some reason, don't seem to get the limelight that CARE does, and the other groups that are a little bit more vocal.
This is true. Someone I could mention would be Zuri Jassa. He's a Muslim. You know him, Muslim living in Arizona. He is certainly the exception to the rule. He is not going with the mass of Muslims who would follow a non-questioning approach. In many ways, he's more a product of Western society, certainly American society. And as he often says, he's a very proud American. And he also would insist that he's a very religious Muslim. But he's the exception, unfortunately.
Yeah. Unfortunately. We're talking with Ant Greenham, and we're talking about his book, The Questioning God, and this is Energy-On Hangouts. And we've talked a bit about Islam and the lack of questioning there. Let's go to the other side of the spectrum. You cite in your book Judaism as going to the other side of the spectrum, so to speak, and questioning a little too much. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yes, absolutely. Let me say a quick word about my my relationship to the Jewish people. I lived in Israel for 4 years. It was an absolutely mind-opening experience. I couldn't think of any better way of taking a young man aged 26 and just getting him to expand his intellectual horizons than by placing him in Israel. I was working with the South African Embassy in Israel at the time for 4 years in the early 80s. But this is an intensely questioning society. And I think Jewish people are questioners because, quite frankly, it emerges from from the essential source document, which of course is the Hebrew Scriptures. And of course, most Jews, if they spend much time considering or reading the Scriptures at all, will typically just read the first 5 books, the Pentateuch or the Torah, as it's called. But as I've already pointed out, there's a good deal of questioning there. And Jewish society has developed an intense questioning approach. Now, it's been said that in some ways Jews are more happy in asking a question than finding an answer. A phrase that I like to quote, and some people might take this as anti-Semitic. I don't think it is. It's where there are 2 Jews, there are 3 questions. Now, I heard a lovely expansion on that. I do a world religions practicum. I take students here in the Raleigh, North Carolina area to different religious sites every spring break. We visit the mosque, we visit synagogues, we visit Buddhist temples, Hindu temples, and so on, and basically get to hear from those practitioners what they believe. I really enjoy our trips to the synagogue, and this year at the Reform Synagogue, the Rabbi Margolis, said specifically, no, not 2 Jews, 3 questions, 3 opinions. Where there's 2 Jews, there are 5 opinions. I think that demonstrates the fact that the more questions, the more options, the more alternatives, the more digging you can do, the more intellectual ferment there is in the process, the better. That's the Jewish people. Now again, not all Muslims are the way that I described Islam. Certainly not all Jews are this way either. There's certainly a narrow trend in Judaism, especially of the ultra-Orthodox variety, where questioning would be discouraged. But I think in general, Jewish people are intensely inquisitive, and I believe that this is the main reason why Jewish people have been so successful in the academics and the sciences, Nobel Prize winners. If you look at the number of people who are in those categories compared to the total number of Jews worldwide, about 14 million, it's an astounding comparison. No other group of people come close. And I really believe that the real answer is because they're questioning, not because they're necessarily intellectually superior to anybody else, but the way that you get to discover how things really work is by questioning, inquiring, analyzing, and I want to add something that the Jews are really strong at, being self-critical. I made a mistake. Why did I make that mistake? How am I going to avoid making that mistake again? That's the way that societies, individuals, peoples advance.
Now, you're describing that almost as if that's something that we should aspire for as Christians.
Yes.
Do you think that's where we should go, or do they question too much?
Well, let me add one thing about the Jewish people. As I note in my book, is that there's a sad exception to the questioning that Jewish people engage in, and that is probably the most important question of all, which is, could Jesus be the Jewish Messiah? And it seems that this is a question that they either have a superficial answer to, and then it's pushed aside and not considered, or they don't want to raise it at all. And as I mentioned in my book, there was a survey done in Israel in 2008 where about 3,000 people were stopped in the street and asked if they would participate in the survey. 2/3 of those people, as soon as they realized that the questionnaire concerned Jesus and Christianity, they refused to have anything more to do with it. So about 980 odd people actually participated in the survey. And of those folks who were willing to participate, the amazing thing was that, I mean, there's a whole bunch of findings, but I'm just highlighting one here. Only 5% of them had even heard the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, which of course is central to Christianity. And here, this is from people who are so interested in so many things, yet only 5% of those who were willing to participate in the survey had even heard the claim. So here's a very striking anomaly, and just as I point out in the book, it's a real shame that this is one question that Jewish people aren't prepared to dig into. I understand why. There's the Holocaust, and there's centuries and centuries of egregious, nominal Christian persecution of Jewish people calling themselves Christians. I read a part of a biography of Mendelssohn recently, and in 18th century Germany, if you were a Jew going into Berlin, there was only one gate in the city that you were allowed to enter. And there you would be stopped and interrogated, and you might or might not be given entry. So, just one example of this incredible history which Jews have suffered. And so for that reason, they're super sensitive about the subject. So that'd be one of the reasons why they are reluctant to ask questions on this subject. But they should, because Jesus is their Messiah. And when they make the inquiry, what a wonderful discovery so many of them make.
That is true. We're talking with Ant Greenham in his book, The Questioning God. And we've talked a little bit about Islam, and we've talked a little bit about Judaism. So I assume you're going to say everything's well and good with Christianity and the questioning front.
Well, what I think is the problem here is that Christians are not as biblical as they ought to be. As I alluded to earlier, if you walk your way through the scriptures, Old and New Testament, you'll find God asking questions all the time. Just to follow on the question you asked earlier about having the right to question God, you mentioned Abraham. Job is perhaps one of the best examples here. Job certainly asking questions. He's allowed to do that, but then he's taken to task by the Lord at the end of it. That passage in towards the end where God answers Job out of the storm, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? And yet, after Job realizes that God is so much higher than he imagined, yet God has this incredible affirmation of Job in contrast to his three friends. He says, Job has spoken of me correctly, in comparison to the three friends. The three friends have to ask Job to sacrifice on their behalf. But Job, with all his questioning, is the one who is affirmed at the end of the book. The three friends who simply regurgitate a cold orthodoxy are the ones who have to come to Job, and Job actually acts as their mediator. And I think the tragedy is Christians too often have a narrow, cold orthodoxy, and they just repeat that again and again without seeing the wealth that we are meant to have as, firstly, people made in God's image, and secondly, people who are saved by Christ and who are becoming more and more like him. But because he's a questioning God, we become better and better questioners as his followers. But many of us don't.
Unfortunately, yeah, biblical literacy is not really high, and I think one of the reasons is because we don't ask enough questions. We don't ask. I think part of it is fear. We don't want to go into some of those verses because we're afraid what we might find. I teach a class on the Bible, and basically, how did we get it, and can we trust it?
Yeah.
And one of the things I have to start off with, when I begin the class, is I have to start off by saying, we're going to be addressing some serious issues here, and if you've never heard of these before, some of them may challenge your faith, but stick out the class because it ends well.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like we don't even want to ask the question, and it gets us into trouble. We go ahead.
I think that, in a way, answers the question you asked at the very beginning about God being true, but the questions are to lead to that truth. You make a statement that it ends well, but then how do they discover that it ends well? They have to go through the mental engagement process. And so their confidence in the fact that it ends well will be so much stronger through going through that course than if they just took your word for it and didn't give it another thought.
It's easier to just to be quiet. I know one of the enlightening things that I did in my life was I happened to college. I took a course on American history from the 20s to the 40s, basically between the wars, 1920 to 1940, and we had to do some research in the newspapers. And one of the things I did was I looked in the Los Angeles Times and I looked in the religion section, and I traced the religion section over that 40-year period. And it struck me that at the very beginning of that, it was extremely active page. There was lots going on. There's churches were putting in big advertisements, come to our church and hear this discussion on X or Y, or a lot of it, dealt with evolution or whatever was the, inspiration of the Bible, or whatever the hot topic of the day was. You could go to your church and you'd hear discussions about it. And right after the Scopes trial, whether it was directly tied to that or not, but in the mid-20s, suddenly that kind of went away. And by the 1930s, the religion page had dwindled down to largely our church meets at such and such an hour. And just to see what happened, I traced it out through the, quickly, sampling through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and up into the 70s. And what happened is by the 1970s, the religion section went away completely, and it was merged into the entertainment section. So yeah, I think what happened is the church withdrew. It stopped engaging in the questions, and it stopped engaging in society in the mid 20s. And I think we see the results of that today, because we don't ask questions, we don't get out there, and we don't then have the confidence to state our view. And when we do, it oftentimes doesn't come off very well, because we oftentimes say a little more than the Bible says, therefore, which works real well in a church, but if you're talking to people that don't believe in the Bible, that's not a very convincing argument.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. It was fascinating to hear your description of that, and I'm not sure how we can turn the thing around. And so much of the input that people get is incredibly shallow. To be perfectly honest with you, I hardly watch any TV. I get most of my news online, so partly because I read a lot faster than people can talk, so it's you can assimilate more information that way. But we were on a little trip, my wife and I, just the last a couple of weekends ago, and so we watched some TV, which is unusual. And I was struck by the way that a documentary, which was quite interesting, was about the Jonestown massacre in Guyana back in the 1970s. It was quite an interesting and well-made documentary, but it was just strung out for so long. You could have effectively communicated the essence with the interviews and the interesting background to what had happened and why in about 50 minutes. But then after every 10 minutes or so, you had to stop for commercials, and they lasted a good 4 or 5 minutes. And essentially what could have been less than an hour was dragged on for 2.5 hours or more. And so one wonders, if people are fed this kind of thing when we're talking about something serious like a documentary, let alone most of what they get, which is just short little sound bites, 30 seconds, interspersed with all sorts of things, you wonder if people are at all equipped to ask questions, to do the digging, to really get to know the scriptures and Christianity the way it is.
No, sadly not. And I know with a lot of churches, Bible study is something that's for the old folks, because they still want it. It's not something we actually do with younger people. And I know Henry's got another author who wrote Rite of Passage, and one of the comments he makes in there is that a lot of youth see their youth classes as a great fun place to go, but they don't think them as so much as spiritual places where they learn about God. It's where they have a lot of fun activities. And I think this de-intellectualization of the church, and we end up almost encouraging a culture that does not want to ask questions because we're afraid of what the answer might be. And we don't know how to deal with passages, tough passages in the Bible, like if your child rebels, you take them to the city elders, and you have him stoned to death.
Mm.
I was actually surprised when I heard Dennis Prager is a Jewish talk show host, and he pointed out that's one of the best verses in the Bible, and not just for parents of teenagers. It's a passage that transferred what was really going on. It was just transferring the control over the life and death of your child away from the parent and giving it to the community, to the city elders at the gate. And once that happened, it ceased to happen. Most of cultures of that period, the father had absolute right of life and death over anyone in their household. And you see that today, even in other cultures, they have honor killings, and the idea that if you dishonor your family, it's the family's obligation to kill you, because that's a very serious offense. We don't understand that in Western culture, largely because of the influence of the Bible, and particularly that verse that says you don't have a right to kill your children. If you want your child prosecuted, you have to take them to the city elders, and it becomes a community affair, which you can very quickly see why people may not want to, air their family laundry out in the middle of the town square, and you can see very quickly why that would put a stop to killing children.
And that's an excellent approach, because once you start digging, you see, wait a bit, there's more to this than just meets the eye, rather than just simply superimposing the way we are here in the West in the 21st century back onto a very different society. You're seeing how here is a way of improving a very different society, and not making it perfect, but at least pushing it in the right direction. I get to say the same thing for an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The common reaction when someone is offended, if you take my eye, well, I'm going to make an example of you, and I'm going to take both of yours. The Bible says, no, you don't. Any kind of retribution has to be proportional. So there's already a move in the direction of limiting revenge, and of course it goes the whole way with Jesus, where he says, turn the other cheek. But that element is already there in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and that's what we don't know. We're at the end of the 2,000, 3,000 year long questioning process, and we've incorporated a lot of that into our culture already, to the point that we don't understand why we think the way we do, and we don't even understand how anyone could think any different. How would we go out and kill their kid? It's inconceivable to us. And then, so when we read statements that basically started us on our path, we don't understand them, and we rebel against them because they seem harsh to us at the end of the process.
Yes. Something I would add here, especially if we're looking at some of the more difficult aspects of the Old Testament, some of the killing of the Canaanites, and some of the wars and other things like that. A word which I find helpful is the word trajectory. And the Old Testament is not the end of the story. It's the introduction to the story, but really the key story is Jesus Christ. And the Old Testament prepares for him all the way back in Genesis 3:15, the Proto-Evangelion, about the seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent. And really, this is what one needs to see, is that this is moving towards the climax being Jesus. And so these people had to be prepared to produce the Messiah. And so steps had to be taken to mold the society in a certain way. But the molding of a society is not the perfect end product. It's simply, if you like, getting the mold ready for the object that will emerge from the mold, Jesus Christ, to be the focus for absolutely everybody. And I think that idea of trajectory is very helpful in dealing with some of the admittedly difficult passages in the Old Testament.
I agree. I mean, for example, take one of the bigger issues is slavery. If you look at the Old Testament, yes, the Old Testament did permit slavery, but it put a lot of controls on it, to the fact that it largely disappeared within Judaism, and the rabbis had a saying about it, that he who buys a slave buys a master, because if you were going to do slavery biblically, and if you're going to have a slave, why wouldn't you do it biblically if you're a follower of the Bible? An absolute prohibition is much easier to ignore than if you're going to do it, this is how you should do it.
Yes.
And you see slavery largely disappearing because of that. And you see that particularly when Christianity took over Western civilization, the fall of the Roman Empire, you see slavery largely disappearing completely until Europe re-encounters North Africa and Islamic countries where slavery was, and unfortunately, even to this day, remains a major factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the country of Mauritania was the most recent to abolish slavery. This is now officially 1980. But of course, once you start looking at what's actually practiced, having lived in the Middle East, you have these workers coming from other third world countries, desperate for a job. The first thing the employer does is take their passport. Now, they are technically under contract. They would be employees, not slaves, but often the first month would be withheld from a worker. One way of keeping them, and of course, the master's holding the passport, there's not much that the worker can do in terms of going home. And so, in a way, you've got ongoing slavery, even though it's not given that name.
Yeah, it's a sad testament that we oftentimes seem much more concerned about slavery that occurred 200 years ago or 100 years ago than we are about slavery that's still occurring today.
Yes, and the whole issue of people trafficking, this is a huge problem, and it's got a different form to the way that slavery used to be. As you know, typically slaves today are owned short-term, and are exchanged from one owner to another, often in the course of a day or two. And trying to track and stop that is a major task. But again, Christians have been active in pursuing that. And I think the questioning approach again would be crucial to this. What is it makes the system work? Who are the beneficiaries? What are all the implications of any particular legislation that would be designed to stop it? What are the international aspects? If we impose this legislation, how are the other people going to react? I see our time just about running out, but just a quick comment on an application of questioning. I think that's often what's missing is the question: if I do this, how will my opponent or the person I'm interacting with react? How will they see it? How will they respond in the context that they find themselves in the light of their interests? And so often people are just pushing their own interests without any thought to how it's going to have an impact on the other guy.
Yeah, I agree. One of my cardinal rules for apologetics as an apologist is, really good apologetics starts by really good listening.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
You have to listen to what the other side is saying, which in and of itself is actually a questioning process, because you have to, you're basically asking the question, what do they actually believe, and then you have to listen for an answer.
Yes, yeah, listening is crucial, and the questioning approach is certainly going to help one listen. What's the person actually saying, rather than how do I respond to this? How can I come with a defeater argument that's going to shut them up? You don't want to shut them up. You want to hear to see where they really are.
Yes. Well, we've been talking to Ant Greenham and his really good book, The Questioning God, and it's been a wonderful conversation. I want to thank you for participating with us. Is there any closing words? We don't have much time here, but maybe 30 seconds or so. Do you have any final closing thoughts that you'd like to end with?
I think the encouragement would be, if you encourage questions, don't be afraid of being asked a question you don't know the answer to. There's nothing shameful about saying, I don't know. As long as you follow it by saying, let me do my best to find out, or to consult with people who can help you answer that question. So I think that'd be the simple answer to that one. Thank you very much for having me this evening. I really appreciate the chat. It was very stimulating and very enjoyable. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say that's actually that's my one-size-fits-all answer to everything. I don't know, but let me find out. And that in of itself, I believe, actually encourages conversation, because it tells people you're interested in what they're saying. Anyway, we've been talking to Ant Greenham, his book, The Questioning God, and hope you've enjoyed this conversation. We will be having another one next week at this time, and we look forward to seeing you then. Good night.